Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Excited to be with you all once again. My name is Mariam Pira. I am the coordinator for the local Weal group here in Chicago. I'm joined by some of our friends, including some of the editors from Commonweal, Gabriella, and of course our wonderful hosts from the Bernadine Center at CTU. Thank you, Peter, for being the man behind the curtain. And I'm very excited to welcome today. It was a little like pulling teeth, but we finally got him here to have Mark Evans Piper join us for our Weal meeting. And actually, he's the spotlight of our meeting today, so he's really on the spot. Mark is going to be talking to us about his new book. Let me just do a little pitch. It's called Interrupted Presence. And I'm really excited to hear him share with you all what the process was like getting this all put together. Just a couple of ground rules before I introduce Mark. Please do keep your microphones muted during the presentation, just so that we're being respectful of everyone and we're able to hear and not getting background noise. I don't know about you all, but there's constant construction happening in my neighborhood, so it's very loud. But that doesn't mean we don't want you participating. Please feel free to use the chat, post questions, comments, links to articles. We'll be monitoring the chat as the program goes on, and that will feed directly into Q&A, which we are leaving plenty of time for at the end of the program. And at that point, we'll invite you to unmute yourselves, get on camera, and hopefully start a good discussion around the presentation today. So without further ado, I will just read a quick bio for Mark Evans Piper. He's the Director of Ministry and Mission Advancement for the Sisters of the Senegal of the North American Province. Piper is a Mercy Associate, an alumnus of Amate House, a Young Voices contributor for the National Catholic Reporter, and lives in Chicago with his wife and 2 young children. He earned a bachelor's in political science from St. Xavier University and holds a master's in leadership and policy studies from DePaul University. I'm a Jesuit loyalist, so I won't hold it against him. Mark, without further ado, I'll hand it over.
Well, thanks, Miriam. And never good to start with a correction, but we wrote a book. I see Miriam and I see Sister Marissa Butler. She was also a contributor, one of the 11 for this book. And I see lots of faces I know, a former boss, Sister Carol, a former professor, David Knapp. Nice to see you. And so I have, if you'll indulge me, an 11-minute spiel about this book and how it came to be, and then we shall open it up to others. I believe Miriam might read a part of her own contribution, and we'll go from there. And so, as always, I'll say, good evening. My name is Mark Piper, and I had an idea, one I thought was worthy of putting pen to paper and worthy still to publish, that interruptions are the stuff of life. They present themselves on a daily basis. We might grow accustomed to them or begin to expect them if they did not present themselves in such varied ways and in such expansive intensities. Though varied and expansive, on the whole, I think an interruption tends towards a negative connotation, an unwelcome disturbance. For every excitable, guess what, or great news, it seems there are far more, excuse me, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but, or other unexpected, jarring interruptions without warning. Perhaps this was a bit of what social scientists call recency bias. These thoughts were noodling around and taking hold of me in the spring of 2020. Of course, the year 2020 was rife with interruptions and riddled with existential crises. An unabated and deadly pandemic with its subsequent economic destruction, social unrest and demands for racial justice, and a rancor-filled presidential campaign fueled by conspiracy theories. So many of us experienced so many interruptions in so many usually unpleasant ways. And yet, God called creation good. And the grace of God, unlike most family gatherings in travel in 2020, was not canceled or postponed, or so I believed. In point of fact, one morning during my first pandemic-induced furlough, I picked up my coffee mug and a book called Unexpected Presence: 12 Surprising Encounters with the Divine Spirit. I read a story each morning. Then I promptly emailed the publisher, thanking him for publishing such a book, and expressed my gratitude for its increased value during a tough time. The thanks that I got, the publisher, Greg Pierce at Active Publications, emailed me back and said, "It's probably time for a new installment of this anthology. Would you find the authors and edit it?" Now, I've known Greg Pierce for about 5 or 6 years, primarily through the National Center for the Laity. And while I'd never pitched a book idea to Greg before, Greg knew that I wrote for the National Catholic Reporter and other places that publish essays on faith, community action, politics, or the mingling thereof. I had also pitched a book idea to another publisher a few years earlier. And though rejected, I now had a little experience in this world. Emphasis on little. Furthermore, while I have been published, I had never been an editor of someone else's work. Those editors were the folks at the other end of emails, whom I loved and appreciated, save for when they tried to remove my Oxford commas. In any event, Greg greenlit the idea of another anthology. And through the next 12 months of finding authors, compiling, and editing these stories, I came to believe that interruptions can be an experience in God's grace. The 11 stories in this anthology express this reality because their interruptive events were accompanied by, or occasions of, God's grace for that particular author. Often, this grace of God was not perceptible at first. As such, these stories are collections of interruptions where, upon reflection, one could ask and answer this question: where was God's grace in all of this? Because again, I think that I, along with many others, were asking, where's God's grace in any of this last March, April, and May? You might conclude from these 11 stories that while God's presence may not be evident in every interruption, interruptions remain avenues to walk among, experience, and appreciate the grace of any given moment or event in life. These essays, with their wildly different interruptions, show a human capacity to grow, to suffer, to find grace and spiritual sustenance. From being interrupted to being the interruptor, from interrupting persons and thoughts, from family life to schooling, childhood and young adulthood, and from the mundane to the criminally heinous. It is really staggering just how interruptions happen to us and also how we respond to them. A quick digression. I suppose for any of you Jesuit-educated folks, Miriam excluded, the interruption that was the cannonball that laid up Ignatius of Loyola, an interruption that changed his life and is now 500 years old and soon to be celebrated across the globe starting tomorrow, can attest to this. So I had this idea. The idea was refined with a publisher, and there were a few more important steps before I could even get to the compiling and editing of these stories, in hopes that a manuscript might take shape one day. First, for this book, when Greg Pierce and I talked about the idea of this anthology, of an interrupted presence, we came up with a few guidelines before he turned me loose to find the contributors and pull this together. The pandemic was interrupting life, but this would not be a collection of pandemic-only stories. We wanted first-person narratives, 1,500 to 2,000 words in length, centered on an interruption, any interruption in one's life, where grace, God, or spiritual sustenance had been found, and we were looking for folks who followed a religious or spiritual practice. Most of the authors here are practicing Catholics. We were also looking for a particular age cohort, younger professionals. Almost all the authors here are millennials, born between 1981 and 1996. So long as it was their story to tell, they were welcome to tell it, with one more, albeit big, caveat: no moralizing. As you read these stories, you will not get a self-help guide nor a dogmatic, if only you do this, you'll find God. 2 of the 11 authors are Catholic priests, but I assure you, I have edited out the preachy or homily-like tendencies from all of us. And it wasn't even the priests that had the most homily-like tendencies in their writing. It was me. Another point about this anthology is that the voices are intentionally diverse. While there is the commonality of age, word count, and spiritual practice, the publisher and I wanted the reflections of God to be at least somewhat reflective of God's people, female and male, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as white, and lay people, as well as vowed religious. I would like to gratefully acknowledge Clarissa Algentera on this point. I have had the privilege of knowing or working with each author in this anthology except for Danielle, Marlon, and Vivian. I would not have been in contact with Danielle or Vivian were it not for Clarissa, nor would I have known to contact Marlon were it not for a mutual friend. As such, I wish to thank Clarissa as profusely as I thank Greg Pierce, the publisher, for supporting this project and ensuring its diversity of voice. As a first-time editor, I was also seeking out another variable in prospective authors. And all told, I had substantive contact or agreement with over 28 potential authors for this book. I wanted these authors to have had some experience or passion for writing. They did not need to be formally published, but I didn't want to do their stories or act a publication a disservice by not doing the requisite edits as a novice editor. And also, having dealt with editors, I didn't want to be someone's first editor. Cowardice that I didn't want to contend with the possibility of receiving a first draft an author thought was amazing, only to have me potentially email back, please entirely rewrite and resubmit. That didn't happen. Now, that could happen to an experienced author too, but it can be quite devastating the first time around. There is one final and important point on editing these stories. All the interruptions are true, many are of a serious nature, and some are of an intimate part of the author's life, thereby necessitating vulnerability on their part. While I asked some authors the general topic in advance, overall, they all had complete license to write about whatever it is they wanted to write about. Submit it to me, and we'd go from there. That was a leap of faith, and I think I lucked out that there was a natural diversity in the types of interruptions. I'm very pleased I didn't have 3 or more of the same topic and would have to deal with that issue. I'm pleased also that these wonderful authors didn't shy away from serious or complex topics. And further, I'm pleased that one author realized the original story they submitted really could not be told. A hang-up for us young adults is that many interruptions relate to work. And even if it's a phenomenal story, it's hard to write about certain things for fear of career-ending honesty, even if it relates to race, misogyny, or other necessary, though taboo topics at work. Or if it's about one's present workplace and maintaining confidentiality required just too much dancing around names, events, and topics. Lastly, this book was compiled for reflection. A reader is invited to enter these stories by pondering, discussing with others, or journaling with the 3 reflection questions that are provided at the end of each essay. Laying out the stories from first to last and refining those questions, though difficult, was perhaps the highlight of this process. I would now be happy to entertain any questions about the process of creating this book, or if you have a copy, to have direct questions about the book. If there are no questions at this time, I would also be more than happy to invite Miriam, one of the 11 contributors, to read a portion of her story, of her interruption.
Thank you, Mark. Someone ask a question and please save me from having to read on video. Gabrielle, am I missing any? Nobody has posed a question yet, right? I don't want to interrupt. No. Okay. Well, looks like y'all are stuck with me again. I've been trying to figure out kind of a good, actually I've been editing my own work in the process today, Mark. And I was trying to find sort of a good starting point. I don't want to give it away, even though it's not super preachy, I hope. I don't want to give away the whole moral of the story. You'll have to read it to get it. But the overall interruption is My identity was stolen in 2016. Somebody had my social security number and fake ID with my name and their face. And they had quite a nice shopping spree in several states under my name. And needless to say, it was kind of a core interruption in the middle of what was otherwise a very nice summer. So I'll just start reading a little bit. The way I was alerted to this was I got an e-receipt in my email, and that just sort of snowballed into all sorts of other discovery. Since I checked my credit at least once a year, it's like an adult report card, and I was always a good student. I was able to log into my accounts and put a freeze on my credit. This meant any company trying to run my credit would get a rejection or have to contact me before approving a request. Then I went to my local police station and filed a police report. Since I had all of the receipts, it was simple enough. They told me a detective would call me in a few days and ask me questions before looking into the matter. Spoiler alert number two, they would not. I became expertly adept at navigating the phone trees to get to credit fraud teams over the next couple of weeks. Since most of the charges were on existing store credit cards, I started preemptively checking every account. I made note of any unauthorized transactions, store numbers, addresses, receipt numbers, dollar amounts. I called stores and asked associates all kinds of questions. They probably shouldn't have been so forthcoming with information, but I appreciated them all the same. When I could reach people who had completed transactions, they all gave me the same physical description of the other me. Other times I got to managers who would give me a transaction information or receipt, but no description of the perp. Since I hadn't heard from a police detective, I called to see if they'd made any progress on the case. A detective called me back and told me my report was ready at police headquarters and I could go pick it up. I asked him if he'd gotten any video surveillance. No. I asked if he'd found or talked to anyone. No. I asked, "What's in your report besides copies of the information I gave you?" "Sweetheart," he began, "I'm 9 months away from retirement. We're never going to find this person. I suggest you get a gun." I literally shook my head and did a double take on the phone. "Detective, are you saying you think I should have shot this person? Because my home wasn't broken into, my identity was stolen." "Yeah, this is how the animal operates now. Good luck." Click. So much for protect and serve. Still, I'm pretty stubborn, so I decided to call the police at the city in Wisconsin where the second largest stint of the shopping spree I was sponsoring occurred. I talked to a very nice woman on the phone and explained what happened. She politely listened, but told me that identity theft has to be reported in your local jurisdiction, so there wasn't much they could do. I thanked her and hung up. I was ready to give up when my phone rang, and on the other end was a detective. He said he'd overheard some of my conversation with his colleague and asked if I could fill him in. I did. He asked what the response had been from Chicago police, and I told him. He wasn't surprised. He asked if I'd be willing to drive up to make a police report in person, since they can't actually turn someone away from making a report. It just can't be done over the phone. I said absolutely. That weekend, my older brother drove me to that city and two other Wisconsin jurisdictions where I filed police reports and shared my 10-page Google Doc of notes. This detective wasn't working on the weekend, but his partner was a huge help. I got back home and felt that I was finally fighting back at this seemingly invisible crime. 2 days later, when a Menards card I had definitely not applied for showed up in the mail, I hit a new low. I started to question why I bothered working in nonprofits, trying to help people and make the world better. Maybe I should just let everything burn, Old Testament style. Maybe that's exactly what the world deserved. So that's my excerpt. All right. Questions from our participants. We would welcome it. Maybe I'll just pick books from the shelf and start reading.
Or maybe, Marissa, you were also a contributor. Did you want to share going to put you on the spot. Thoughts of what the process was like for you?
Yeah, it'd be great to have a dialogue.
Oh, gosh, I had a feeling you were going to put me on the spot. I almost left my video off.
I tried to convince him not to.
So what is your question? What was it like?
Yeah, what was the process like?
Well, I guess when I got the email from Mark asking me if I wanted to participate, I guess I was a little shocked. I mean, I'm one of those writers that doesn't share my talent. I'm a gifted writer and I kind of keep it to myself. So I was like surprised and honored at the same time to be given the opportunity to share a story of being interrupted. My particular story that I wrote was an interesting way about it. I wrote about how the interruption in another person's life interrupted my daily schedule. And I don't know, it was fun. Like Mark said, there wasn't any, mine didn't come back to me and he didn't tell me to write it over again. I was terrified. I was like, I don't even know if I want to send this in. Like, am I going to be told to redo this whole thing? Is he going to like regret asking me to, be one of the contributors? Like I said, it was just, I was honored to participate and write a story about how my life has been graced in an interruption.
Was it a particularly challenging time, Marissa? I guess I'm projecting a little on you. I know Mark at some point had to reach out to me and say, "Hey, are you, are you still doing this?" And I had half a draft written, but with everything going on with COVID, I just felt like I couldn't wrap my head around doing anything productive, like just going to work virtually every day and existing just drained me, and it felt like very much an uphill battle for me.
I actually had like a very short break in between two busy CPE units because I was doing my clinical pastoral education, and I knew that if I didn't write mine at that moment, that I wasn't going to have the time to do it. And so I think I probably was one that wrote it really fast and turned it in surprisingly quickly. But otherwise I would like, that was my motivation to like hurry up and put something on paper because I knew my schedule was going to pick up and I wouldn't be able to give it the time that it deserved.
And yes, Marissa, your story's very good. No one ended up having to go back other than, again, the one person who they self brought it back because they realized it was just too difficult to tell the story while dancing around names and events without giving things away. And I will say, and I don't know if it was COVID or other items, but as I mentioned in the introduction, I mean, there were a good number of folks who, like I said, all right, this is the idea. You've got a week or two to think about it. And there's really no pressure. But if you want to move ahead with us, I need, like, here's the date where you agree so we can move together. And there are about 8 people who agreed at some point, and then it didn't happen. And again, I don't know if that was a symptom of COVID, upending life, as 2 people said it was, but I don't know if it was for others as well. And so that was one of the more difficult. And I would also say, to the point about, for those of you thinking about writing or having written, one of the first things I did after I got a group, the initial 6 or so, is I sent them a rough draft of what I was talking about. I said, so here's a story that I'm probably going to do. I'm one of the 11. And I said, this is what I constitute as rough in a rough draft, right? I mean, it's not fully developed, but it's developed. and it has a little cleanup to do, or there'd be some discussion of moving things. But I mean, it's not emphasis on draft, not rough. And so people got that, and it was good. And I will also bring attention to the fact that Clarissa just joined, who is a contributor of this anthology.
Hi, Clarissa. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. It's so nice to be here.
Thank you. We're actually just sharing a little bit what it was like for us to, what a pain Mark was, obviously, throughout the whole process. We're just sharing a little bit about what the experience was like of writing these pieces. Um, Happy to invite you if you want to tell the audience a little bit, Cliff Notes, what your story was about.
Yeah. My name is Claire Salhantera, and I wrote the title. I think the title was A Summer Walk, and it was a story about just last summer, probably in early June. I think Marcus was corresponding with the group, and it had been a couple of weeks after George Floyd was murdered, and I felt really strongly at the time of writing about my experience in raising Black and Filipino son in the city of Chicago, and like what that meant to me, but also like as an adult who grew up with the image of the Good Shepherd on my wall, a really fun uh, image, animals and people. I think I really hadn't exploring the idea of really being angry with God and kind of encountering God through anger, because I know so much of the way in which people experience God in the Old Testament was through anger and fear. And I thought, that's not something I'd done for myself. So I wanted to explore that in writing and, what it would mean to kind of tell that story. So that was one piece of like how to, because I've always written, my background's in newspaper journalism, and so I've just always written, and that's not something I've done publicly. I mean, definitely in my journal, but I think the other piece of that was because that at the point that the series was coming together, that was also a point in our nation. Here we are in the midst of COVID, starting to settle into racial unrest that is still kind of has obviously has started before like COVID and still continuing. But I think that was also a public place for me to say, like, I'm going to put on paper for the world, how I feel about this, and how this affects my family, and how this, will affect the church, and kind of how I work and live and breathe in that space. And so I just let it rip. And I was like, I was scared when I turned it into Mark. I was like, oh God, I sound so angry. And, like, I don't know how this is going to work. And I wasn't sure. I was like, are these stories of like happy God and like God saves us, and I think, definitely saved in a different way. I think in just kind of teasing the story out and saying, some of it is finding that hope and that joy in what could be, and resting in that and trusting in that. And so for me personally, that was also the the gateway to what has been a lot of ministerial opportunities around the area of racial justice and racial injustice. And so that was really my first yes, Mark. Like, you gave me that chance to be like, okay, I'm gonna put this out there. Let's see what they say. And it's a yes that God has continually put forth in my life. And so without this experience to even have that first yes, I don't know. And I think move toward the wind and like the little bird. I think just this place to do it publicly on paper was all the stories are good. They're like it's on my bedside table, and I read like a couple a week. And so all the writers have such great truths that we're sharing. So thanks for asking, Miriam.
Thanks, Clarissa. That was all Mark's idea. I'm just coordinating here.
Could I put Clarissa you back on the spot one more time, and you can obviously decline, and I appreciate the compliments, but maybe tell folks the class you're teaching now and all that. That's, I think, related.
Yes,
a little
it
bit.
is. So I started writing like the essay, and I started to put stuff on social media, and like any like any good bottom top generation Xer. I'm like probably the oldest contributor. And I was just like putting stuff out on social media. I graduated from the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, and some of my former faculty members follow me on social media, and they're like, at some point at the end of the summer, they reached out and they wanted to see if I would teach a class on anti-racist ministry in a Catholic context. And that was because I like some of the teasing I think I did in the essay I wrote on social media. And I love the fact that they came back and said, "Yeah, we think you'd be perfect." I work for the Catholic Church full time in ministry, and so they also like recognize that, but that if you're interested in more conversation. It's being taught at, sorry, I know this is a joint CTU, a joint CTU platform, but I'm teaching at Boston College. It's a virtual class. It's one unit. It's at the end of July. It's on the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry website. And I'm excited because I think it's talking about anti-racist ministry in the Catholic Church is a good and important place for us to be right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for pitching that. That was really valuable. Clarissa, I'm going to have to look that up. I'm excited. Thank you, Gabriella, for her question. And I'm actually happy to sort of pitch this to Mark and whoever else of the contributors would like to share. To all contributors of the book, did you find the writing process as helpful or more or less helpful in processing moments of intrusion and uncertainty as perhaps reading a book like this? That's a really interesting question, Gabriella. I'm curious how everybody's going to respond.
Yeah, I didn't ask Greg, the publisher, but in our early discussions, we had both thought, and I think correctly, that there would already be COVID books in the work, and there'd be this increase of man, almost like spiritual autobiographies of how difficult this time was, and how this interruption or intrusion or unexpected issue or uncertainty would increase. Those sorts of writings, or at least what do you call submissions, would increase. But we also kind of thought that the demand for such writings were not going to increase. It may be cathartic for an individual like to journal about this. The way we got to interrupted presence is, again, because the book wouldn't be exclusively about COVID, although I kind of am the one who write about work-life balance and COVID more about my family. We're in this situation, and so we're kind of looking back at previous interruptions, right? So obviously none of us who are writers were alive in the 1918 flu pandemic. So this was a new experience. In one sense, it's all brand new for all of us, but we've all faced interruptions, or unexpected job loss because of COVID or anything else. And so it was partly to look back and to remember. And I think that was cathartic, at least for the writers. I don't know if it's helpful for the readers, but that's why we put the reflection questions there, is we want to make it useful, and to see how one might have dealt with positively a previous intrusion or interruption. So we tried to do the balancing act, not COVID centric or just intrusion on all, but just how we can use our past experiences when we face these new ones, and not just those past experiences, but particularly past experience where we can look back and believe that there was the presence of God or some sort of grace or spiritual practice that helped us or got us through or was of value to us.
Either Marissa or Clarissa, would either of you like to respond as well? No pressure. I'm thinking about this now because I mentioned earlier that Mark had to ping me a little bit because I just couldn't get myself to put words on paper. Part of it is, and I don't know if other people who are writers professionally feel this way. My background's in journalism too, and sometimes the headspace I need to really write is very difficult to come by. And I think it's largely because I'm undisciplined as a writer, and I'm not someone who, I have friends who, make themselves write every day. Every day I'm going to write for this amount of time. And they get into this very like ritualistic habit of it, which is probably very effective. I'm not that person. I just fundamentally lack the discipline. I need like a good manic episode, and that's how I get things done. Um, but part of the challenge was dealing with sort of the compression of living in COVID for an extended period of time, and I was pretty strict about observing a lot of sort of public health guidance. Um, Sitting and thinking about what I had talked to Mark a little bit about what my story idea would be, and I settled on this one around the identity theft because it wasn't just about the interruption, right? It's sort of like maybe the interruption overshadows the presence part of the title in some ways, because it wasn't just that something crappy happened, it was something really powerful happened as a result of something really crappy happening. And that was really valuable for me. And so talking to Mark and kind of being able to be authentic of how much I was struggling to put words to paper because of where I was mentally with COVID helped me deal with COVID better, because I could go through the process of having written, oh, remember that other time in life where something was really hard and you didn't know how you'd get out of it? This sort of contributed to kind of building some momentum for myself and saying, actually, you have ways of getting through challenging times. And part of that is family and support, but a lot of it is just reflecting and prayer, or reflection and prayer. So that was a really helpful question, Gabriella. Thank you. Marissa, Clarissa, I want to open it up. I don't want you all to feel like you can't contribute.
I guess for me, I often say, like if I'm in a place where I feel stuck or like a moment of intrusion or fearful, that I can look to my past and see that God's grace has never abandoned me. And during COVID, it was really hard to even like imagine that that was even possible, to look back and be like, yeah, like I've gotten through all of these things, but I don't know that it's going to work this time. But having the opportunity to, like really sit with, the story that I wrote, but also other ideas that I had tossed around